I am here with Blake Hutchison, the CEO of Flippa.com. How are you today, Blake?
Good, Steve. How are you? Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, for sure. I'm doing fantastic. So Blake and I were just catching up a little bit about Flippa and my experience with it, and a few listeners slash viewers have heard my story about buying and selling businesses. But I'd love to hear your story, Blake, like how a little bit about your background and how you came to start such an awesome company like Flippa.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity of being on the show. Thanks again.
Hmm.
My background's pretty diverse. I've recently joined Flippa as the CEO, so I've been in position there for just over 9 months, and that's I suppose the end of what has been a really really good and interesting journey for myself from both a technology landscape, but also from a professional learning landscape. I've learned a lot from the diverse and successful businesses that I've worked in. So I've recently, before Flippa that is, spent some time back in Australia, where I'm sitting right now, working for companies like Xero. So I was on the Australian leadership team there, and Xero is obviously a very fast growth ASX listed company, so Australian Stock Exchange listed company. Most people do know it. However, it's a big competition to Intuit and taking on the small business accounting software space. And then I ran a business called Luxury Escapes. Luxury Escapes is a $300 million online travel business selling packaged holidays, which are well priced, which they take out to a largely Australian but growing Southeast Asian and North American customer base. And then 9 months ago, joined Flippa. I'd actually tried to sell my own business on Flippa back in, what was that? So that would be back in 2014, and had probably a similar experience to yourself there, actually, Steve. At least from the seller's standpoint, I think you're a buyer on Flippa, but hugely rich community of buyers and sellers trading assets and online businesses, and had a very interesting experience myself going through that process. I owned a marketplace. It was a marketplace for specialty food retailers, and so we dropped that on the Flippa platform for sale back in 2014. So became very familiar with the business back then, and over time have kept an eye on the business, and was ultimately approached by the founding team, two marketplace entrepreneurs, Matt Miskovit and Mark Harbottle, who are also the co-founders of 99 Designs. And so I found myself at Flippa about 9 months ago.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. I think it's so important to be on both the buyer and seller side to experience that, because I very much started out as a buyer, and then once you get very almost identical to real estate, that's how I describe a lot of this to people is, if you buy a website and you want to fix it up, almost like rehabbing real estate, you could flip it right back on the website if you so choose to. So as far as like, that's great to know that you're in control now. That's awesome. Having met many CEOs, many founders, and many operators, I think it's important to have like a hands-on feel for the business from the ground up. That's why I always recommend, if you're at a startup, get your hands in on the customer service, learn what the customers are doing, learn what people like about your business. And I think it's fantastic that you actually were a seller and then went into the CEO. That's awesome. So as far as like the team now, you joined 9 months ago. How big was the team? I guess when you joined, is it bigger now? Is it smaller now? And where's everybody based? And are you guys distributed?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. We're distributed, so we have a relatively medium-sized team here in Melbourne, Australia. So we're 20 strong here, and that's predominantly our product and engineering function. And so what we've got is a team of engineers. The platform's built on Ruby, and they are working with a head of product, obviously myself, and we've got a core operations team working out of Melbourne as well. We have a distributed sales and account management function. We run relatively lean, which I know you're quite familiar with from your personal background. And so we've got account management across either the sell side, the buy side, or with broker management. And that's a distributed function. So we've got account management and sales working across Melbourne, Barcelona, Austin, Texas, and in Baltimore. And then we have a small team also working out of Manila, which is predominantly customer support.
Excellent. That's a lot of time zones that you have covered.
Yeah, you're doing interesting hours if you're in my position. But look, it makes for a very interesting challenge because Flippa is a global community. And
Yeah.
so we have fast growth communities across Southeast Asia. Obviously, the business is predominantly built and run and backed by our community operating in North America, but it is very much a distributed community buying and selling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I've advocated for a lot because there are brokerages out there, and I saw that you guys have released recently more of like a brokerage style feel, or like a redesign of the front end. And I wanted to touch on that in a minute, but I love and what I tell people is, if you want to control the entire transaction yourself, not that a lot of brokerages are controlling a lot of it, but they kind of are with the deal flow of the buyers if you're selling and vice versa. So that is fundamentally to me the most important part to Flippa, that marketplace, that fluid marketplace of assets, and allowing people the freedom to communicate amongst themselves and just sitting as the marketplace. So with that being said, are you guys offering, and I wanted to touch also on financing, but are you guys offering like a brokerage style in addition to the marketplace? Or are you guys going to stick with just the free flowing marketplace? And what does that look like?
Yeah, so the marketplace is the core Flippa business,
Mm-hmm.
and that will remain the case certainly for a very long time. I can't imagine that we would ever be a business other than a marketplace and platform business. In fact, we absolutely believe in the network effect that Flippa has right now, and we'll continue to invest there. The interesting thing is, over time, the average asset value on Flippa has increased.
Mm.
And so with increasing value, you've got complexity of sale. And so what we need to do is apply a layer of people, well, intervention is not the right word, but people assistance. And so whilst we won't ever be a broker, we do believe that buyers and sellers, and simply because they're telling us, want the assistance of some good minds at the table. Now, as you know, there's a big community of regular buyers and sellers who operate on the Flippa marketplace. But in reality, the businesses the online website, the websites and online businesses that we're seeing sell are being bought by new community members. And so new community members typically need help. If they're a seller, they need to understand how to set their business up for sale, what the value of that business might be, how to use the platform in its simplest form. And if you're a buyer, you need to understand, obviously, again, how the Flippa platform works, how to conduct due diligence, where you might be able to avail yourself of financing, how the contract of sale process works, ultimately how the due diligence process works. And a lot of these processes, the marketplace does a good job of, but the higher the value of the transaction, regardless of how strong the marketplace is, people will typically need some help.
Yeah.
And so that's really what our approach to buying and selling is right now. It's really just to provide that assisted service. But to your point, there is a great network of brokers out there around the world. And our view is that they are partners of ours. We completely accept and value the part that they have and the place they have in the ecosystem. And so we partner with those guys.
Excellent. Excellent. And that leads me into my question about financing. So having a background in fintech and having a background, especially in lending, when I saw that you guys were offering finance, that to me was kind of an aha moment where I said, okay, wow, literally the whole supply chain of buyer to seller, and then digging even deeper in to the buyer, allowing financing lowers the barrier to entry, in my opinion. And I think that was a substantial move, and that was recent. So I believe that was you're doing, but I'd love to learn more about what brought you guys to do that, and what does it look like?
Yeah, great point. I mean, I think that critically speaking, most high value deals are subject to some kind of financing arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
And that can take on many forms: seller financing, a 401k rollover, or Rob's loan, an SBA financing loan, or of course, some people are still taking out a standard bank loan to buy a business. Now, that means that Flippa needs to have some part to play in that ecosystem, and we get to see the deal flow. And so by seeing the deal flow, seeing the businesses that come on board, we're able to essentially assess those businesses for financing. Now, the assessment may be formal in partnership with a bank or non-bank lender, but it can also be informal in the event that the seller is open to something like seller financing. We can provide education around that and set them up to be able to offer that to a potential buyer. And so, yes, what we've done is we've started out with a partnership with Guidant Financial, and that's the beginnings of what we think could be a very, very rich lending ecosystem. And to be candid, it's in its infancy right now. So all that really happens is a buyer can get pre-qualified for a loan, and when they find a business on Flippa, they can then present that business to Guidant Financial for assessment and hopefully speed up that lending process. So it is in its infancy, but I would say that 50% of all deals we see over $100,000 in value have some financing aspect to them, which is extraordinary, right?
Yeah.
Cash is cheap right now, and people are more likely to want to use a financing arrangement. And to some extent, it also gives buyers who are less wealthy the opportunity to participate in the ecosystem, which I think is fantastic. It's such a burgeoning environment. There is so many amazing online businesses out there, and we need to give more buyers the opportunity to, instead of start those businesses, buy businesses and take on established traction.
Yeah, definitely. And that's great that you see that the same way, is that it's the ability to allow more people access. And that to me was the aha moment, where when I saw it, I was like, okay, this is excellent. Because first of all, Flippa is a free marketplace to go in. There's a transaction after, the transaction begins as escrow. And for everybody listening, I've advocated for this in the past, where in the US, at least, there's an accreditation that happens, and non-accredited investors are, very highly regulated, I guess you could say. It's meant for protection, but in reality, you could go to Vegas and just bet all your money away if you wanted to. So there are alternative asset classes that exist on Flippa, online businesses, that I find to be an amazing, amazing alternative to these whole, accredited versus non-accredited, because it's a marketplace and you're talking to another person that's willing to transact with you. So with that being said, I guess we mentioned traction, or you just mentioned it. So where are you guys at as far as numbers that you can mention and share with buyers, sellers, maybe businesses sold? What can you share as far as traction goes?
Yeah, I can talk to sell side and buy side intent. So what's actually happening on the marketplace from a transactional perspective. So the critical thing about the buying and selling of websites and online businesses is, to some extent, we haven't hit the tipping point yet. The digital small business economy is rich, but it's getting richer by the day. There are ludicrous statistics around as to the size of that ecosystem globally, and we're obviously tapping into that. But I truly believe that we are nowhere near the tipping point, and the evolution of the digital economy as it relates to small business ownership is fast growth. Flippa sees around 4,000 online businesses or websites list each month. Now, that excludes apps and domains. So on the Flippa marketplace, just to be clear, we have websites and online businesses, and then we have domains and apps. And domains and apps are isolated as different assets. And it's mostly, not always the case, but it's mostly a different buyer base. And so that's why we isolate those numbers. And so the fastest growing area of Flippa is obviously websites and online businesses, and they're the sellers which are seeing the most value from the platform right now. From a buy side perspective, and I must admit, this is a relatively new measure, a new metric for us, if you like, because historically, whilst we understood if someone bought something, they were a buyer, and if someone sold something, they were a seller, we hadn't really isolated the buyer pool. And so we're now doing that. So mid-January, apologies, we launched buyer registration. And essentially what a buyer can now do is create a set of preferences, essentially what we call a buyer mandate. And that enables us to then match them up to relevant assets, online businesses, websites, etc. And so we're seeing 4,500 new verified buyers come through the platform each month. And so what they do is they create a preference center. They go through identity verification. It's free. There's no cost to a buyer. It's really so that we know what to match them up to. And so they're the two areas of the marketplace that we're really thinking about right now, because marketplaces are amazing in the sense that there's a richness of information, but to some extent they're also a bit of a maze. The art of a marketplace is being able to serve up the right thing to the right person at the right time and facilitate that transaction at speed, and try to close down on some of the friction that they might find in a real world environment. And so that's what we're working on right now. We're seeing about 50, depending on the month. It's given we're such a high value business, there is some lumpiness to the way we operate. So depending on the month, we'll see 50 to 100 small websites or online businesses sold.
Okay, excellent. That's a healthy marketplace. I mean, both sides.
And then I should say, and then tens of thousands of smaller assets sold.
Got it.
In any given month.
Got it. Yeah, I think education is going to be key with new investors coming on. I think that when it comes to educating people on what they're buying, it's almost like the difference between someone investing and someone just kind of speculating, where an investor is very educated in what they're putting their money into. So I think education is going to be such a fundamental piece to onboarding those 4,500 buyers every month, and probably would increase the bottom line eventually after you see people that are understanding how to communicate. They're learning about different deal structures like earnouts that, in my opinion, are probably the most fundamental thing for beginners to understand, where it's like the seller financing of this space. And for everybody listening that's not familiar with that, it's where a seller agrees to take a small percentage up front, and then monthly profit is given to the seller. And basically they can seller finance to or owner finance to the buyer, and small chunks are paid out each month to the seller from the buyer. And I think that education around those things is going to be so fundamental in the future of Flippa. Well, you go ahead.
Super interesting point there, Steve. I think that we're seeing more and more deals done with seller finance. It gives both the buyer and seller a lot of confidence and comfort. So think of the seller like the bank. They are essentially giving you the access to the asset for a lower upfront price, and then you repay that seller back over time on some agreed amount. What we're typically seeing is that seller financing deals are done on a 5 to 10% interest rate. Obviously, repayments are typically payable monthly. We're seeing everything from repayments made over a 6-month to a 36-month period. Sometimes even for a lot longer, depending on the size of the business. But we're seeing a lot of deals done in that regard. I think it's becoming very, very common.
Yeah, yeah, and even if people listening have seen my YouTube series on Flippa, you've seen that I did a deal for $50K that was an earnout where it was 50% up front, 80% of net profit each month was brought to me. And then ideally there was a balloon payment at the end of 12 months. But eventually we just ironed it out into perpetuity. So it was just this kind of consistent return. But that it's a fantastic space. And I love that you guys are doing all of this for investors and helping people understand what's coming. So with that said, what can we expect from Flippa over the next few months, quarters, years? What are you looking at?
Yes, there's a couple of things. Firstly, markets. So we're seeing a lot of demand out of Southeast Asia. It's one of the fastest growing digital small business economies. And so we're seeing good deal sizes come out of those markets and a very mature Southeast Asian seller base. So if you are an investor, if you are an acquirer of online businesses, take a very good look at some of the e-commerce businesses coming out of Asia, in particular Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore. I think there's some good deals to be done there. So markets will continue to acquire new sellers across the globe, and then the service proposition itself. So what we're doing right now is we're, I guess, reinvesting in some core features which the marketplace have come to love over many, many years. So we were able to figure out that the watching of a seller or a group of sellers is absolutely critical to the onboarding of a buyer and ultimately the education of a buyer, and finally a buyer ultimately acquiring something. So we're investing in that watch functionality, enabling investors to watch the right business owners at the right time so that they're getting a ready access to new businesses that they come on board. And probably the newest thing would be we're working on this concept called the Negotiation Hub. It's really just an evolution of the Flippa discussion forum, but with a whole range of new features. So you'll be able to have recorded phone calls like we are right now. That's great from the perspective of being able to save into a profile any given conversation that you've had with a buyer or seller, particularly as it relates to a negotiation. We're also baking in some legal services, so you'll be able to tap into a network of lawyers on the platform. So once you've actually got a firm offer, you can then work with a network of mostly North American-based lawyers to begin with, who are familiar with online asset and online business purchases and can help you through that process. And in addition to that, we'll obviously be evolving our lending proposition. So there's a lot on the radar, but we are very conscious of change fatigue. And so we're making sure that we invest first and foremost into the marketplace dynamic and keeping that as rich as we can.
Excellent. Yeah, I found as a final note, the watch feature is definitely one of my favorite features, and I have seen people get creative with it. I want to say like a year ago, there was a guy who I was following, and every time a comment was posted, it sends you a notification if you're watching them. And it was him commenting on updates. So I was getting emails with the updates that he was sending on the comments of the post, which was pretty brilliant. I mean, it was his own way of sending me an update to my inbox. And it's just amazing how when you give people things, they just figure out a way to not necessarily abuse it, but stretch what it's for.
Yeah, you know what? And the community is so large on Flippa. So there are lots of creative entrepreneurs doing very, very funny things with the functionality. The one thing I'll say, I think it's a really awesome stat, is we figured out that 50% of the buyers on Flippa have watched 10 or more listings before purchasing. And
Ah,
so it shows you that people are, well, they're browsing for one, and two, that it's unlike most marketplaces. It's not the type of thing where you find exactly what you're looking for on day one. There is a bit of an incubation period.
yeah, yeah, that's excellent. Cool. Well, how can people help? How can they you know contact you guys, and how can they sign up?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. If you're a buyer, definitely hit Flippa, register, create a buyer profile, and immediately we will save those preferences. We'll start sending you relevant listings. But also there is a buyer management service. So if people just feel like they need a little bit of help, there's a call to action on the homepage. It simply says, "Do you want to talk to a buyer manager?" So register there, and we'll get in touch and help you to understand how Flippa works. One, but two, we'll also be on hand to actually pick out businesses which we think are relevant for you, because it can become one, all consuming, but it's also a little bit intimidating when you first come across the marketplace and so many listings. So that's from a buyer service perspective. On the sell side, we have account management. So the minute you list over a certain value, you get assigned to an account manager, and that account manager will be in one of our offices around the world. So you're not alone. It is a self-service marketplace, and that's how we've seen it grow to the size that it is today. But you're not alone. We've obviously got a relatively big team which is on hand to help with both buy and sell side services. Of course, if you want to hit me up directly, no problem whatsoever. I'm at blake@flippa.com. I'm always into customer feedback. I spend a lot of my time speaking to buyers and sellers, just hearing what they like about the marketplace. I was on with a couple of sellers out of Moldova late last night, actually, just hearing what their experience was with Flippa and their feedback. So always willing and open to a chat and just to hear from our community what they think of what we're up to.
Excellent. Well, you heard it, ladies and gentlemen, a CEO getting his hands in dirty with the customer service. I love it. I love it. That's raw feedback. Well, thanks so much for sitting down with me, Blake. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. It's wonderful to have a chat, and big part of, thanks for being a part of the community. It's wonderful to hear.
Definitely.